Okay, so this question, somebody asked, how do I get my character to transition into another character? And so what we're going to do in this little tutorial is we will transition this guy, another glitch asset, into this older version of himself when he comes in contact with this plum. You could consider it a power-up or something like that. And we're going to do it through animation. So we'll take this guy and I'll just walk you through what I've got so far as far as assets that I've pulled into this thing already. I've brought in these two images, they're just PNGs, and this plum, and I've also brought in this little iceberg thing. The iceberg I just stretched out all the way across here so that we could have a platform to walk on, and the little platform has a box collider 2D on it so that we can fall to it. My little guy is just this normal thing that we bring in, and it has a box collider and a rigid body. And it also has a guy controller script attached to it. Script right now doesn't do much, I'll show you it in a sec. And then I also dropped this plum into our scene here, and that also has a rigid body and a box collider. And the other thing that this plum has is that it is tagged a plum over here. And so that was something that I had to do after I brought it in. So remember, if you bring an object into your scene and you want to tag it, you drag the PNG into your scene like that, and then you click on the name and go over to tag. And if you don't have a tag named plum, which probably most people don't, you can go to add tag, type in your name, hit the plus sign, type in your name, and then go back to your plum, and then it should be in the drop down menu and you can select it. So that's what I've got going so far. If we open the script up, the only thing that's in there is in the update loop. We're checking to see if the right arrow is pushed, and if it is, we move over to the right. And let's see. So when I run, my guy is going to go to the right if I press the right arrow. No other buttons do anything because our script doesn't look for that. And as soon as I crash into this thing, it just sort of pushes it. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that when we crash into this thing that we want to transition into this character here. And the way we're going to do that is through an animation. I have a couple extra tabs here, and if you don't have those on yours, you can just go up to Window and Animation and Window and Animator, and those things will pop up here. And we want to add an animation to our character, and these are going to be one frame animations. We're not getting too crazy just yet. So each animation will have one frame. We have our young guy animation and our old guy animation. And we'll switch between the two of them when we grab the plum. We'll make ourselves old, and that's how it's going to work. So make sure you have this guy already in your scene, the young guy. And once you do, you can click on the guy over here on the left, which is just selecting this object in the scene. And then go to your animation tab. And right now it's going to say that, to begin animating this guy, create an animator and an animation clip. So we can create it. And this is going to be for our young character. So I'll say young animation. That. And what we'll have here, notice that not really anything showed up in here. And if it needed to, we would have all sorts of different frames of our animation in here. But since we only have one, we don't have anything. And then in our animator, we have this thing that showed up, young animation. And this is our animation state for our young character, which is how we're going to start. If we hit the go button, we'll see that nothing has changed. It's still there. So we're going to make an animation, another animation. Right now we have our young animation. We're going to make one that's our old animation. So from this animation tab, I'm going to click in this little drop down menu and create new clip, and we'll call it old animation. And what we'll do in this one is just drag up the old guy into it. And now that'll be our old animation. And once we've done that, if we go over to our animator, now we have this old animation state that we can go to. If I right click on that and say set as default, it becomes orange, and this is how we start. And so now when we run, it'll be the old guy. But I'm going to go back to our animation, our animator window, and set that as default. We're going to start young. And if we collide with the plum, we want to transition to our old animation. And the way you can do that, if you right click, you can say make transition and draw an arrow where you want to go. So somehow we will transition from young to old. And I'll right click, make transition. I right clicked on old animation, I dragged back. Somehow we'll be able to transition from old back to young. And the way you transition through these arrows is through parameters. And right now you look over here and our parameters is selected, but there aren't any. So we're going to add one. And I'll click this plus sign, and it's a Boolean, and I can say is young. Okay, so if is young, when we transition from young to old, if is young is false, then we're going to be old. And so here's our conditions. I've selected this arrow here, see how it turned blue? And so to transition from young to old, our conditions here, we're going to say if is young is false, we'll go from young to old. And then to go the other way, we'll say, we'll hit the plus sign over here, if is young is true, we'll go from old back to young. So if is young is false, we're going from young to old. If is young is true, we're going from old to young. And notice this one is still orange. That's our default. And when we run, he went to old. So let's go back here and take a look and see. Is young, we'll set the default to true. And then let's see if that works. So now he's young. And then it's going to transition to old animation whenever is young becomes false. And we're going to do that in code. So a couple things that we want to do in our code. If I run this thing again, when I crash with the plum, we want to make the transition from young to old. All right, and so we're going to do that in our code. We've done collision code before, but we'll do it again. So void collision enter 2D, oops, collision 2D, call. So this is when a collision occurs between one object with a rigid body and a non-trigger. And so we'll say if call.gameObject.tag equals, what are we colliding with? Remember, this script is on our player, so if we're colliding with something called a plum, then we want to do something, and we want to destroy our plum. First off, call.gameObject. And then the second thing we want to do is set our variable for our is young. So when we collide with the plum, we will say get component animator dot set bool, set bool is young false. All right, so we get to our animator. Here's our Boolean is young. It defaults to true, and we're going to set it to false. That's about right. All right, and that's only when we collide with the plum. And if we do that, Unity will handle the transition going from young to old because we've set this variable here in our code. And if we run, let's see what happens. So we're young, hit the plum, and we turn old, just like that. And then you can write, whatever code it is to switch it back. Like maybe it's only 5 seconds, and it will switch back to young, or maybe it's you have to get something else to switch back to being young. But you do it the same way. You get the component, the animator component, this thing. You set your variable, and we can have different types, right? We can have float, int, bool, or triggers. You set it, and then according to these transitions, it'll switch and play the different animation. And in this case, it is only 1 frame for each one, so there really isn't any movement. But you will see the actual, character change to this one because this old animation, if we look at our animation tab, is the old guy sprite. And if we look at the young one, that would be our young one that we started with here. Old animation is the old one. So that's how you do it. Let's run through this again. You'll see it'll change to the old guy, and you notice that that time there was a little bit of a delay. And if I click on our different states here, let's see here. It's on this transition, has exit time. And so even though there's only one frame, this animation still has a time period that it's going to take to play its animation. So if you notice that last time I run it, it didn't change exactly right away. But if we uncheck this has exit time, then as soon as we hit the plum, it'll make the transition like that. So just depending on when the transition needs to take place, that has exit time checkbox here may give you what you want or what you don't want. So if it looks weird or it's not transitioning at the right time, double check the functionality of this has exit time and see if that works for you or not. So that's it.